Thanks, y'all. I get that all the time, really. It's a special place. I hope you appreciate how special it is. I know one day, every single one of you are going to appreciate how special this week is. And I want to thank you, Crystal and I both want to thank you for allowing us to be part of this time here. This session that's in, the third quarter, Rick? We're at the tail end of the third quarter. Thank you for investing in this time that we have together. I want to thank Brad for continuing the work that Rick started when I first got involved in COBA. The reason I'm involved in COBA, he said in our breakout session yesterday that I came around looking for something to do. That is not true. I came around the COBA building looking for free snacks one homecoming Saturday morning, and I got recruited. But I'm so thankful that Rick drew me into the things that were going on in COBA and got me involved. And I'm so thankful to Brad for continuing that work and making it his work and investing in you guys. Someday you're going to understand how special a gift that you've been given. Not only this week, but just the time that you've spent at ACU and the time that you've spent around COBA, even if you're not a COBA kid. I wish that my ACU and my College of Business had this, and that had been as intentional about investing in me and my fellow students in the early 80s as COBA is with you guys today. And it's frankly the only reason that I'm involved is because of how missional Rick was and how missional Brad continues to be in providing things like this. So thank you for that. So I'm going to start off. First session, we're going to talk about salt and light. I know you hear about that a lot. I think I have a little bit of a unique view into what it means to be salt and light. It's going to take a while for us to get there. But I'm going to set things up for you, and we're going to have a discussion about that. First thing I want to talk about is my assignment. This is the second time that I've spoken at Summit, and Rick's given me the same assignment each time, which is not helpful. He says, talk about what you want to talk about. And he specifically said to me, talk about something that you would have wanted to hear when you were 22 years old if you were sitting in that same chair. And that just basically leaves a whole lot of things on the table. Most speakers would rather have a specific assignment. You need to talk on this topic or that topic, and we can kind of craft around that. But Rick laid that out there for me. And when he talked to me about this particular opportunity, it was the same thing again. Just talk about what's on your heart. So thank you for that assignment, Rick. The other thing that you might know about public speakers is that there are two time slots that they would probably least prefer. It's the one that's between you and your lunch, and the one that's between you and your dinner. Guess which two slots I have? Thank you very much. Here's my promise. I'm going to be done with this session at 11:55 so you can go across and grab some lunch. Here's what's going to happen for the next 50 minutes. I'm going to spend a ton of energy talking about some things that are very important to me and that I'm passionate about. I'm going to burn about 1,000 calories up here. So if you will give me the same investment of maybe a couple hundred calories of mental energy, this is going to go great. And then the second session, which half of it's Q&A, I hope that you have some questions about the content and my experience and the things I've had to share with you. When I think about what I would want to say to you sitting in that chair that I wish somebody had told me, there's an element of the School of Hard Knocks that's part of that. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. First, just a little bit about me. You may have seen in the bio. So the most important thing that you should understand is that I married my best friend in 1986, and I'm still married to my best friend today. We were talking about having somebody in your life that can be your best friend, who you can talk about anything with. I encourage you to have those in your life. I have a couple. My very best friend in the world is sitting back there in the back of the room. So I'm blessed to have her in my life. That's the most important thing. The second most important thing is I have 3 awesome young men that I've been able to be part of their lives. They also all went to ACU. I was here in the 80s. I graduated in 86. My oldest son graduated in 12. My middle son graduated in 16. And my youngest is going to graduate in 21. That's the plan, right? Yep. So there's been some, this thing is just weird. There's been some things along the journey that I'm proud of. One of the most important things to me was the way in which Rick and the board honored me in 2012 as being a distinguished alumni, and in the way in which we celebrated that. I've got the thing on my wall, the plaque, and some pictures from that event, and I look back on that with a lot of fondness, and I really appreciated that opportunity. And as Rick mentioned, one of my other really important jobs is to be a shepherd for the church there in Plano. And then from a professional perspective, which is probably what you think I'm going to talk about the most. So I started 3 businesses. The first one I started in 1985. You might notice that that's while I was still at ACU. My experience in starting a small business while I was at school at ACU in the 80s was not typical. There weren't a lot of students that were starting small businesses. I'm really, really happy that that's actually more typical ACU experience now, that we have the Griggs Center and we're talking to you guys about the opportunity to start small businesses and to get involved and to think about your dreams and actually not waiting until you graduate to start working on those. And I'm really happy that there's that opportunity on campus. They didn't really have that, but I started my first business in 1985 while I was still at ACU. I started the next business in 1989, and then I started another business in 1994, which I sold to PFSweb shortly before our initial public offering and became the VP of e-commerce and then the CIO, and then I became the CEO of the company in 2013. And it's been a great journey. So today, I'm the CEO of PFSweb. We have 2 different business units, Live Area, which is our digital agency, where we help our clients take care of the digital part of the e-commerce experience as we use technology to build that user experience you're familiar with when you go online and shop a brand. And PFS, which is our order orchestration, order fulfillment business, where we actually help deliver the physical experience. When you order something, you want the package to show up at your door. We help facilitate all of that work. So two different businesses sort of under one roof. I'm excited about our business because we're basically reinventing our business every 3 or 4 years. We're actually going through a reinvention right now where we're changing the nature of both sides of the company. And so for me, as a sort of adrenaline junkie and always looking for change and wanting to see change, it's an awesome place to be. And it's a great company to lead. When I look at that history, I could put up a fairly impressive resume for you guys. I could give you a bio and a LinkedIn profile, and if all I look at are these top points, these above the line points that you guys have charted in your own lives, it would be a fairly impressive resume. Start 3 businesses, be part of a public company, rise to the level of being the CEO, create a lot of shareholder value. Maybe not as much right now as I'd like, but over my tenure, done a pretty good job taking care of our shareholders. There's lots of accomplishments there. If I want to just take those top points, I can probably sketch a pretty nice picture and talk about myself a lot, and maybe you would find that impressive. I don't really know. A lot of times that's what you're going to see from somebody in their bio and what they're going to talk about when they're talking about themselves, but you're hardly ever going to hear them talk about those points that are below the line. But you can't have somebody that's had a almost 35-year career without them having some of those below-the-line points. We just don't really like to talk about them. But the assignment that Rick gave me to tell you something that I would have wanted to hear myself when I was 22 requires me to talk about one of those below-the-line points. It also is related to the fact that I started that business in 1994, because that was not my intention. In 1994, I did not have the idea that I was going to start a new business. It just happened. And this story is going to revolve around what happened in 1994. So I don't know how many of you heard of this term. You know what a mulligan is? What's a mulligan? Yep. So in golf, it's when you have a bad shot and the people that you're playing with allow you to take another shot because the one that you took was so poor. You know, there's the definition. A shot not counted against the score, permitted in unofficial play, to a player whose previous shot was poor. What's another word for a mulligan? Do-over, second chance. What's a theological word for a mulligan? Grace and redemption. You're going to hear, if you really hear, a lot of business leaders' true story. You're going to hear a lot of redemption stories. You're going to hear a lot of stories about grace. You've probably already heard some. You're going to hear one tomorrow morning that is powerful. I have a story like that. I have a redemption moment. I have a point in my career that I can say there's before September 29th, 1994, there's after September 29th, 1994. It's the date that God gave me a mulligan. He gave me a do-over. He gave me a second chance. I didn't know I needed that mulligan at that point, but that's what he gave me. I'm also going to talk to you today about a couple of books that I would recommend that you read. If I was 22 years old sitting there in that chair, these are some books that I would want to have read that would have made a difference. The first one I'm going to recommend is a book called Derailed. It's from Tim Irwin. He's a friend of the CEO Forum. He wrote this book, and he says in the book that the purpose of Derailed is to shed intense light on our vulnerabilities, the irregularities, the small cracks and fissures that can cause us to derail, whether we're leaders, emerging leaders, or simply navigating a career. Well, that pretty much applies to everybody. It's a fascinating book. And I would say that if you look at the book, the first 3/4 of it is case studies of business leaders who have had catastrophic derailments that you're probably familiar with if you just pay attention to the news. If he wrote this book today, he'd have a whole new set of material to work with. Because over the past year and a half, what have we seen over and over and over again with business leaders here in America? Derailment after derailment after derailment, many of them catastrophic. I'm blessed that my own derailment story is not catastrophic. It didn't show up on the front page of any newspaper, but it was still very much a derailment. What Tim will say about career derailments are there 5 things that come into play when you see a derailment happen. And these are the lessons that come out of those things. The first is that character trumps competence. Competence is really important. Elise said earlier, it's really good to be the smartest person in the room. It's great to be competent, but your character is more important than your competence. You put the two together and you have a powerful combination. But if you're going to only choose one of those things, then choose character first and work on competence. Character will always trump competence. The second point is huge. Arrogance is the mother of all derailers. If you are an arrogant leader, you are setting yourselves up for a fall. The third point, lack of self and other awareness is a common denominator in all derailments. That's where we're going to spend our time today, is on that third point. His fifth lesson is we are always who we are, especially under stress. The makeup that you have that makes you an individual, your giftedness, your experience, your profile, is set by the time that you're between 8 and 12 years old. And what you do to build around that simply builds around the framework of who you are. And we can all do a lot of things to present a different persona or facade to those around us, but under stress, our true selves comes out. And if the true self is flawed in some respects, if there's a crack or a fissure or a flaw, that's going to come out, especially under stress. And a lot of these derailments you see happen at times of stress. And then the fifth lesson is, and this is the most important thing, and this is why what I want to talk to you about today is relevant for where you sit today and not just where you might find yourself in 20 years. Derailment is not inevitable. But without attention to development, it's a probability. The reason that you see so many of these very public derailments is because people are not intentional about heading them off before they happen. Elisa's story yesterday had a potential derailment. She had people around who were willing to intercede before the train went off the tracks in order to pull her back from that derailment. In September of 1994, I didn't have somebody who was pulling me back from the derailment. I had somebody who was throwing the switch to actually make it happen. So September 29th, 1994, I had started my company, the second one that I started in 1989, so we've been in business 5 years. And our business model was providing services to other companies to help them with their technology. We would provide custom programming services to help them accomplish some business purpose. We'd implement ERP systems, we'd do a lot of custom programming. But early in the 90s, this thing came along called Y2K remediation. Businesses started to realize that their computer systems had been programmed in a way that didn't accommodate rolling over from 1999 to 2000 because they were storing their date in a 2-digit format. So 1995, 96, 97, okay, everybody knows what year it really is. It's 1995, but what happens when it's 00? Is that 1900 or is that 2000? And nobody thought to write programs in the 1970s that cared about that. And so there was this big problem in all of the software, and businesses started to freak out about it. And so they were looking for people who could come in and help them figure out where they had problems and to address it. And so we got in on that whole opportunity early. And we were selling services to help people fix that problem. And the calls were just coming in, and we had people calling us. And so we went from a professional services technology company that had 25 people in 1990 to a company that had 100 people in 1994. We probably had revenues of, I don't know, maybe $750,000 to $1 million in 1990. In 1994, we expected to do about $5 million in pure professional services fees, which in 94 was, a lot of money. And so we were going in the right direction, right trajectory. Everything that you'd want to see in a small business was going in the right direction. We started out in a small little strip shopping center kind of office. We knocked the walls down 3 or 4 times to expand. In August of 94, we moved to new offices in Las Colinas in the Dallas area in what was then called the Xerox Tower, which is a premium location. My office looked out over William Square where the Mustangs statues are running through. And I distinctly remember in September standing in my new office in the Xerox Center looking out at Las Colinas and saying, this is what it feels like to have arrived. This is what it feels like to feel success. What I didn't know is that what that feeling was a superficial and false sense of success because I had built that success on a framework that was deeply flawed. Moved to that office building, the strategy's right. I had competent people around me. I was competent, knew what needed to be done. My 4 partners in the business that we had were all ACU graduates. 3 of them were graduates around the same time that I graduated and that I knew personally. 2 of them were individuals that I actually employed with my first small business while I was at ACU. And the other 2 had graduated before I did. So small business, Christian partners, great strategy, right place, right time. That all sounds really great. The morning of September 29th, 1994, I'm sitting in my office getting ready to our weekly meeting. We didn't call them stand-ups, but essentially that's what it was, bringing the management team together to talk about everything going on. I walked in, sit down at the conference room table, and my 4 partners have a bunch of paper in front of them, and our lawyer. And they start to sign papers and then pass them down. This is really bizarre. And they sent me a piece of paper, and it says on there, corporate resolution. And the resolution is to terminate Mike Willoughby as CEO of Integration Services, Inc. And I'm looking at this, wow, this is really interesting. And then there's another resolution that does the same thing as chairman of the board. And I looked at 3 different pieces of paper that essentially said I'm fired, that my partners have signed and the lawyer has drafted up. And I realized in that moment, not only that I was being fired, but that I deserved it. I looked at those 4 individuals, and I wasn't looking at partners. I was looking at people that I had manipulated, had worked through, around, over, in getting this company to where I thought it should be. And while we were successful and we had achieved a lot of things, our culture was deeply flawed. And it was my fault. I signed those papers. They didn't expect me to sign the papers. They figured that the other 4 signatures were enough, and they were. I only owned 45% of the company, so they had the ability to do what they were doing. But I signed the papers too, because in that moment, I actually agreed with their decision. And in that moment, I realized that I had been looking for a solution in my heart to the problem that was now evident to me sitting in front of me at the table. God was so gracious to me. Within a couple weeks, I started another company. It's a one-man company. And for a year, I just did consulting myself and healed. And God healed me for a year. And then we went on and we did some really amazing things with that first company, and I sold it. And because of that, it became part of a bigger story. But that September 29 event and that healing that happened over the next year taught me some lessons that I think you guys should hear about. You talk about salt and light a lot at ACU and in COBA. You are salt. You are light. Jesus said it to his disciples. You've heard it said to you. What does it mean to be salt and light? What's it mean to be that in your community, in your workplace, as a student at ACU? When Jesus said it to his disciples, what did he have in mind? And I've heard 100 sermons on salt and light and an explanation for what that might be. But I'm kind of wondering, what if there was a playbook for salt and light? What if I had a playbook that was given to me when I was a senior that would have helped me avoid that derailing moment where I was fired from my job, where my partner said, we don't want to work with you anymore, not because you're not competent, not because your strategy's wrong, but because you're an ass. Because that's what they were saying. And it came down to that third point. There certainly was arrogance involved. There were probably some character flaws involved. There was some stress involved in what had led up to that. Growing in a company is not an easy thing to do. Bringing a team of people, getting them all going the same direction, for sure. But it unveiled something that was a real fundamental problem for me. And it was that third point. The lack of self-awareness and others' awareness was the common denominator and what led me to that point. I wasn't being salt and light. That's Jesus' directive to us. And by the way, he doesn't say that's what you do. He says you are light and you are salt. So, is there a playbook? If you could go to one place for a reference manual, to use Wendy's term, which I love, where might you go to see what that actually looks like in practice? And I think there actually is a really short little passage in Ephesians that is a key to what it looks like to be salt and light in the workplace, in the home, in the church, at school, in any context that you want to use. This playbook, I think, can be used to be salt and light and to avoid that number 3 common cause problem. So this is something I think if you actually pay attention to and are open to embracing, you can leave the mountain and put this into practice and not only avoid derailment, but actually be a better person and to put into action Jesus' charge to us to be salt and light. So here's the passage. Ephesians 4, 1 through 3. The first thing that we need to all understand is that salt and light is not aspirational, it's a calling. It's not something that's way out here in the future or that's theoretical or hypothetical. It's a reality. Jesus said to all of his disciples, this is your identity, this is who you are. It's a calling. You have been called to a way of life. Here's the second book. The first was Tim Irwin's Derailed. The second one is Os Guinness's. It's a book called The Call. When you go out to practice your particular vocation, whether you're an accountant or a marketer or a salesperson or a pastor, teacher, lawyer, it doesn't matter. Your vocation should be a calling. And what you want to do is to find that sweet spot between the work that you do and the gifts that you have and how God is setting you up to align your gifts towards the opportunity you have to work. This book is all about that. It's actually a kind of a hard book to read. He rambles around a little bit, but if you have the patience to read through the book, there's some really incredible nuggets. But here's a quote from that book, which I can't read it way up there. So it says, grand Christian movements will rise and fall. Grand campaigns will be mounted and grand coalitions assembled. But altogether, such coordinated efforts will never match the influence of untold numbers of followers of Christ living out their callings faithfully across the vastness and complexity of modern society. That's a fancy way of saying it's one person at a time, one day at a time. And people who feel called by God to be in their workplace and in their homes, whatever context, in their churches, are much more important than whatever big movements are created. This is a in the trenches calling for us. But the first thing we have to understand is that we are called to this. This is not optional. If you are a Christian and you're going out into the world, you're called to be salt and light. So what does salt and light actually look like practically? First, I have to understand that I'm called to influence the culture that's around me. I'm called to influence my workplace. It's primarily what we're talking about today. I'm called to influence my community, my church. And so here's a little bit of the rest of that passage. Paul says, I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The rest of session 1, I'm going to talk about light. And then in session 2, I'm going to talk about salt. I think there are two things in this passage that speak to what it means to be light in the workplace. The first thing is, we know we're called and that we're going to have to walk in a manner that reflects that calling. How? By bearing with one another in love. Love is a vertically oriented thing. The love that this passage is talking about is a Greek word called agape. The Greeks are much better than we are about talking about love. We've got this one word, and we love our iPhones, and we love our brothers and sisters, and we love our mom and dad, and we love our wife. And all of those things are obviously different kinds of love. Greeks are much better about giving us specific words. This particular word, agape, is the kind of love that seeks somebody else's best interest. It seeks to maximize somebody else's potential, even above your own. It's a sacrificial kind of love. And in order to provide that, you first have to have your vertical relationship in place. This is a godly kind of love. Okay? The second thing this passage calls out is unity of the Spirit. The way to be light in your community is to, number one, pursue others' best interests, to love them truly, and second, seek to have unity with the people that are around you. So let's dig into that a little bit. Let's unpack that. Here's some specific verses from our reference manual that talk about love. Right in the very first chapter of Genesis, it says, God created man and women, created men in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. The most fundamental thing about loving other people, the starting point that we all have to begin with, is recognizing that everybody we come across is a person made in the image of God. They're an image bearer. Look around the room. Everybody in here is a unique, valuable person made in the image of God. And your value is inherent. It is not based on what you can do or the words that you say or how competent you are. It's inherent because God created you in his image. When you look in the mirror, you need to see that as well. This is an easy thing to say in a macro sense. God created people in his own image. This is a very hard thing to say at a macro level, because we all come across people who do not appear to be made in God's image at all. Right? We come across people who are mean and who mistreat us and who say things that aren't godly at all, and where you have to really work hard to understand that that individual person is an image bearer, and most importantly, that God loves them enough to send his son to die for them. And here's the truth. The more unlovable an individual is that you come across, the more Christ died for them. He took on every one of their flaws and problems and sins and mistakes onto himself. And the more difficult a person that you're dealing with, the more Christ died for them. And who am I to think differently of somebody who just happens to be unpleasant or unlovable when God loved them so much that he was willing to take on their many flaws himself? And how does it change the way I think about myself, knowing that that is true about me? One of the things that I was not doing personally, and one of the things that I was not doing in my first, in integration services, the company that I was fired from, I was not treating the people that I was dealing with as image bearers and looking for their greatest potential and their best interest, and putting myself into a frame of reference when I was interacting with my people, my team, that said, regardless of how you act towards me, this is how I know you, this is who I know you to be. This is how I see you. That was one of the lessons that I needed to learn, is that the people I'm working with, the people that I'm in charge of, whose careers I'm supposed to be helping manage, are image bearers, and God loves them so much that he was willing to send his son. And so what that required for me to do was to get a new, fresh set of eyes. It's one of my favorite chapters in all of the Bible, 2 Corinthians chapter 5. If you're only going to read one chapter in the New Testament, go read this one. It's awesome. It's so full of hope. It talks about our mission. It's a great sort of executive summary of what it means to be a Christian. The first part of it talks about this life that we live that's a challenging life, and oftentimes we're dealing with things that are very challenging. But at the bottom end of chapter 5 in 2 Corinthians, it says this. It says, "From now on, therefore, we regard no one according to the flesh." When you know that the people you're coming across are image bearers, and when you know how much God loves them, it requires you to get a new, fresh set of eyes. And practically, what this means for me is that when I'm going out into my workplace, my church, the community, when I'm talking to investors, especially the activist ones that are no fun to talk to, I put myself in the context of looking at them as I know that they are, and not as how they're presenting themselves to me. It's actually a switch that I have in my mind. And part of it's just leaving the house when the day's beginning and going into that context to say, Lord, give me new eyes. It's also partly when you sit down with somebody that you know it's a challenging situation. Maybe they don't like you or they don't like what you've done. It was mentioned earlier how insulated CEOs can get, because most of the time within the workplace you get the shiny, sparkly story and what people want you to hear, and they say lots of good things about you and how good you are. As a CEO of a public company, you get the other side of it too, which is you suck and I don't like you and you don't think you're doing the right thing and I think maybe you shouldn't be the CEO, especially when somebody thinks that you should be generating more value than you are. No one calls you on the phone and gives you praise, adoration, and thanks for helping them make $50 million, but they'll pick up the phone and yell at you when they lost $5 million. And so you get a lot of interesting sort of polarizing conversations that happen. For me, if I go into a conversation with somebody and in my head I've prayed the prayer, Lord, give me a new set of eyes, it helps me to treat them better and differently and to exit that conversation with integrity, knowing that I've learned that lesson. Okay? This goes on to say that for those of us that are Christians, the basis for this, for not seeing someone according to the flesh, according to the superficial, according to what we see with our eyes, is because anyone who's in Christ is a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. But for those that aren't Christians, that's their potential. So how do I help them, even in a small way, move towards that potential? How do I help them to be a better person as an outcome of that conversation? Lord, give me a new set of eyes. And then there's this unity thing. The Ephesians passage said, bearing with one another in a spirit of unity. Where love is that vertical, tapping into godly love, understanding what God has done for each of us, understanding how God looks at each of us, this is turning that into horizontal. How do I have relationships where we can be in community with one another, unified, even though we're so different and we're coming from so many different places? Still in 2 Corinthians 5, talking about new eyes. All this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. What an amazing thing that God would ask you to be his ambassador. What an amazing and frankly challenging responsibility it is that he would ask you to be reconcilers. I will tell you that there is nothing more powerful inside of a company, within a company culture, than having reconcilers. There are so many people in various workplaces and in the world who are the opposite of reconcilers, that are dividers, that are looking to have disunity, who want to find opportunities to break people down, crush them, say bad things. When you have people within an organization who are reconcilers, who are bringing people together, who are helping to break down those divisions, when you can be part of creating an atmosphere where that happens, a lot of other things take care of themselves in the process. Generally speaking, a company can have great strategy, but if their culture is broken, they've got nothing. Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. If you have a culture where you have reconciling going on and you have reconcilers actively working, you're going to have a good company culture. If you're a leader who is modeling reconciliation, bringing people together, creating unity, a lot of other things are going to take care of themselves. September of 1994, I was not a reconciler, obviously. I had not created a company culture where we were bringing people together. I, in my immaturity, was doing a lot of things that were sort of politically motivated, where it was about me and the power that I had and the accomplishments that I was individually generating. Last time I was at Summit, I talked about compartmentalization and how we can be one person in one part of our life and another person in another part of our life. A lot of people would never have recognized September 29th was even coming. I was serving as a deacon in church, and I was a pretty good husband, not the best, but okay. Raising kids. I mean, I had a pretty good facade. I was probably the kind of person most people said was a good guy. And here I was at work, creating a poisonous culture and not being a reconciler, but being someone who created divisions in my very own company. God held me accountable, and he taught me a lesson. So today, one of the things that I think is most important for my job as CEO is to be a reconciler, to go find the places where we're not working well together, where struggles exist, where we may have created the opportunity for that or facilitated that as a company, and to go address that, attack it, bring people together. And what does it take to be a reconciler? It takes a lot of forgiveness. It's so hard. It may be the hardest thing as a human being to give and accept forgiveness. Paul says, put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you. So you also must forgive. You can't be a reconciler without forgiving, without accepting forgiveness, without facilitating forgiveness. Reconciliation can't occur without forgiveness. We can't be reconciled to God in spite of all of our flaws, in spite of all of our mistakes, in spite of all of our failings, without the forgiveness that comes from God through grace. We're called to turn around and share that grace and forgiveness with those around us, and it's the hardest thing. The easiest thing in the world is to carry the baggage of all of the little things that someone's done to inconvenience, to hurt you, and to keep yourself from being a reconciler in the process. It took about a year for me to forgive the four of them. But as part of that healing process, I did. And I actually talked to each one of them. One of those guys works for me today and has for 20 years at PFS. And we have a great relationship, and he and his wife come over to our house. And praise God for that. And it's one of the things that I give thanks to God for it because he salvaged something out of that moment that's good. Two of the other guys I maintain contact with on LinkedIn and just kind of follow, and we have a good relationship. We're not best friends or anything, but there's no hard feelings there. The other one, there's no hard feelings, but there's not really a connection. Maybe someday there will be, but there's not today. But there aren't any hard feelings. There is forgiveness, and healing has happened. And I learned a really, really important lesson. That self-awareness and others' awareness is really important if you're not going to derail. And if you're not going to derail your company. And then my last two slides in this first session. This scripture says, live in harmony with one another. Don't be haughty, but associate with the lowly. And it ends up saying, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. We're going to talk more about this in the second session. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. We want to be part of creating harmony with one another. And sometimes that means stepping outside your comfort zone and being with people that you don't know a lot about, that are different than you, that have a different perspective, that you may disagree with. By the way, Jesus prayed for you to be unified. Rick said he was working through John. When you get to 17, I think it is, 16 or 17, Jesus is specifically praying for his disciples to be unified, every single one of you unified. You know what he didn't pray for? Unanimity. There's a difference between unity and unanimity. He didn't ask you to be unanimous, he asked you to be unified. You can be unified as a people, as a company, and still disagree. Thank God. Because I don't know a single organization, church, workplace, family, where you're unanimous on everything. But you can be unified. Seek harmony, be a reconciler, be a peacemaker, and so far as it depends on you, live peaceably. You all know sometimes some people just don't want to get along. But I can do my part. And why is it important? I think corporate America, and I would say that organizations across the world are desperate for this. They're desperate to figure out how to bring people together and create a unified culture and have people going in the same direction and accomplishing the same thing, because every organization wants this magic thing called synergy. The dictionary definition of synergy says the interaction of elements that when combined produce a total effect that is greater than the sum of the individual elements, contribution, etc. It means 1 + 1 is greater than 2. It means when you bring people together that work together in unity, the net effect is going to be much greater than the two of them individually can do on their own. Every organization wants this as part of their culture. Every organization wants synergy in order to accomplish the things that they purpose to do. And I don't think it's possible to really have synergy over the long term without knowing that each and every individual within that organization is an image bearer of God, that God loved them so much that he's willing to die for them, that we need to have new eyes as we interact with everybody that we come across, that we need to pursue reconciliation in our workplace, and that we need to be peacemakers. And so far as it depends on us, that we're going to live in harmony with each other even when we disagree. When those things happen, synergy is possible. When you have that in a culture, and great companies have these things in their culture, great things are going to happen, and it's going to be because of God and the Holy Spirit working in that framework. This is how you think about salt and light. the next part is going to be how you act. And the reason I divided up into salt and light this way is because what does light do? Light enlightens, right? It sheds light on the subject. And salt is actually the way it impacts the world, right? So we're going to talk in this second session as we wrap up there about the rest of Ephesians chapter 4 and what that compels us to do as we act toward each other. And I'm going to share the difference that that passage has made in my life and the different leader that I am today compared to where I was on September 29th, 1994. Thank you for your attention, and it's going to be lunchtime.